The message came in at 6:14 a.m., long before the house was awake, while the sky outside my kitchen window was still the dull blue of early morning and the kettle had just begun to hiss softly on the stove. I remember the time so clearly because I had checked my phone to see if the bakery had confirmed the cake pickup, and instead of frosting and balloons, I saw my mother's name light up on the screen. For a moment I actually smiled. In my mind, I was already imagining her usual dramatic excitement about birthdays, the over-the-top promises, the way she always said she would arrive early to help set up, even when she usually came late. I opened the message expecting something cheerful. What I read instead shifted the entire axis of my world in a way I would not yet understand. Things are really tight right now. We're going to have to skip your kid's birthday this year. Please don't make a big deal out of it. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I gave them enough patience. But they stayed exactly where they were, flat, dismissive, and disturbingly casual. No apology. No regret. No warmth. Just a quiet cancellation of a moment that mattered more to me than I was ready to admit. The kettle began to shriek on the stove and I turned it off on instinct, my hand moving automatically while my mind lagged behind, stuck on the strange coldness of her phrasing. Don't make a big deal out of it. As if my child's birthday were an inconvenience. As if our presents were negotiable. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the glow of my phone lighting my face in pulses as messages from friends and coworkers trickled in about the day ahead, none of them aware that something delicate had just fractured inside me. My child slept peacefully down the hall, unaware that the grandparents who had promised for months to be there wouldn't be showing up after all. I thought about how many times we had rearranged our lives for my parents' plans, how often we had adjusted schedules, spent money we didn't really have, and stretched ourselves thin just to include them. The word tight echoed in my head. Tight financially, she meant. Tight enough to abandon a child's birthday. Tight enough to choose absence over effort. I typed my reply with hands that did not shake, even though something beneath my ribs had begun to ache in a slow, unfamiliar way. No problem, I wrote. 2 simple words. Polite. Neutral. Safe. I sent them before I could rethink them, before emotion could override the instinct to keep peace the way I always had. For a moment after I hit send, I just stared at the screen, half expecting a follow-up message, a softening explanation, a sudden reversal, anything that would reframe what she had just done as a misunderstanding. Nothing came. The read receipt appeared. Then silence. The rest of that morning passed in a strange haze. I made breakfast. I packed lunches. I helped with homework. I listened to the excited chatter about balloons and cake flavors and party games that had already been planned out in enthusiastic detail by a child who trusted all the adults in their world to keep their promises. I smiled when I was supposed to. I nodded when I was supposed to. But behind every normal motion, a single question kept forming quietly in my mind. If money was really so tight, what had changed? My parents had never been wealthy, but they were comfortable. They owned their home. Their bills were paid. They had no new dependents. And yet now suddenly they could not afford a birthday. By mid-morning, curiosity had begun to creep in where shock had first settled. I did not think of it as suspicion at first. It felt more like the slow, uncomfortable awareness that something about this explanation did not sit properly with the life I knew they lived. My mother had been talking just weeks earlier about redecorating the living room. My father had mentioned a short trip they were planning, just to clear their heads. None of that sounded like the language of people who were suddenly counting coins. I tried to push those thoughts aside, telling myself that finances are complicated, that people hide stress, that perhaps there were things I didn't know. But the thought would not leave me alone. That afternoon, while I waited in the school pickup line, I opened my banking app with no particular goal in mind, just a dull urge to check the account where my parents were still listed as secondary contacts from years ago, back when we shuffled responsibilities back and forth more fluidly. I had never removed them. There had never seemed a need. Family, after all, was supposed to be safe. As the screen refreshed, my breath caught so sharply that I had to sit back in my seat. The balance I saw there did not belong to someone who could not afford gas, let alone a child's birthday cake. My parents were not tight. They were comfortable. Very comfortable. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Numbers on a screen do not always tell a full story. I closed the app. I waited. But once the doubt has lodged itself into your chest, it does not stay quiet for long. Over the next 2 days, small details began surfacing in ways that I could no longer ignore. A neighbor casually mentioned seeing my parents shopping at an upscale furniture store. A distant cousin posted photos of a gathering at a restaurant I knew they frequented regularly. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I was no longer willing to dismiss as coincidence. The lie was beginning to take shape, though I did not yet know its full outline. On the third evening after the text, my sibling called me out of the blue, their voice unusually upbeat. We spoke about nothing important at first: traffic, work, the weather, until they casually mentioned an upcoming family project my parents were excited about. The way they said it was light, unguarded. I asked what kind of project, keeping my tone steady. There was a brief pause on the line, a shift I had heard before when someone realized they had said more than they intended. "Oh, they said awkwardly, just helping out with some stuff that really matters." I asked what stuff meant. They hesitated again, then answered vaguely. I ended the call politely, but my mind was already racing ahead of my composure. Really mattered. That phrase followed me into the night, into the quiet of my living room after my child had gone to sleep, into the long stretch of darkness where questions grow louder because there is nothing to drown them out. If something truly mattered enough to take precedence over a grandchild's birthday, I wanted to understand why. For the first time, the idea that this might not be about money at all began to settle into me with uncomfortable clarity. I replayed my mother's message again in my mind. The wording, though. The absence of regret. The request that I not make a big deal out of it. All of it began to sound less like apology and more like instruction. As if the reason for their absence was not merely financial inconvenience but something they preferred to keep unexamined. Something they did not want me asking questions about. That night, I did something I never would have imagined myself doing just a week earlier. I opened old family group chats. I scrolled through months of conversations I had barely paid attention to, searching for patterns I had never thought to look for before. And slowly, like a thief uncovering their own stolen belongings, I began to see it. The coded language. The offhand references to plans I had never been included in. The sudden bursts of enthusiasm around certain family members that did not exist for others. The way attention, money, and time all seemed to flow in one consistent direction that did not lead to my home. It was not just about the birthday. That realization landed with a heaviness that pressed directly against my ribs. The birthday was the excuse. The lie was older. And whatever the truth was, it was about to change the way I understood everything I thought I knew about my family. I closed my phone and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the slow, even breathing of my child down the hall. The party was only days away. Balloons were already stacked in the corner of the living room. Invitations had been sent. Gifts from friends were wrapped and hidden. From the outside, everything looked normal. Celebratory. Simple. Only I now carried the weight of knowing that something foundational had shifted beneath the surface of our lives. Something my parents believed could be hidden behind a single careless text. I had said, "No problem." They believed that meant the matter was closed. They did not know that those 2 words marked the moment I decided to stop taking their explanations at face value. They did not know that I had begun to follow the trail quietly, without accusation, without confrontation. They did not know that I was no longer asking whether they were telling me the truth. I was asking where their money was actually going. And the answer to that question was already waiting for me, just beyond the edge of what I was ready to discover. Once the idea took hold that the excuse was a lie, I could not unsee it. Every small detail from the past few weeks began rearranging itself into a new pattern, one that no longer rested on coincidence but on intention. I went through my days as usual on the outside. Work, errands, school pickups, dinner. But underneath that calm surface, my mind was moving constantly, quietly cataloging everything my parents had said and done. Their sudden financial tightness did not match the rhythm of their lifestyle, and the more I allowed myself to compare those 2 realities, the more the space between them widened into something obvious and unsettling. I did not feel angry yet. I felt alert. The first concrete step I took was subtle. I called my mother under the harmless pretext of confirming guest counts for the party, keeping my voice light and ordinary as though nothing had shifted inside me. She answered cheerfully, almost relieved, as if my simple "no problem" had absolved her of any lingering obligation. I mentioned that a few extra friends might be stopping by, and casually added that I might need to pick up more supplies depending on the final headcount. Without hesitation she said, "Oh, don't worry about us, we really can't spare anything right now." The way she said it, smooth, prepared, unquestioned, told me this was not a spontaneous excuse. It was a story she had already decided to live inside. That night, after my child had gone to bed and the house had grown quiet again, I opened my laptop and logged into the old shared financial portal I still technically had access to. I told myself I was only looking for reassurance, for some confirmation that they were truly struggling and that my unease was misplaced. What I found instead was clarity so sharp it almost felt physical. Their outflows had not decreased. They had shifted. Funds that once went toward household maintenance, modest travel and occasional family expenses were now being transferred regularly to a single unfamiliar account. The transactions were consistent, structured, and far too large to be casual gifts. I wrote down the account number. Not out of malice. Out of necessity. The next day, I took a longer route home from work and stopped near my parents' neighborhood under the pretense of needing to pick something up from a nearby store. From the parking lot, I could see a moving truck parked outside their home. 2 men carried furniture inside. Large pieces, new pieces, the kind that arrive wrapped in plastic and promise reinvention. My mother stood on the porch giving instructions. My father laughed beside her. There was no tension in their posture. No sign of strain. No body language that resembled people who could not afford a child's birthday cake. I sat in my car for several minutes watching that scene unfold, feeling the last fragments of doubt finally evaporate. The lie was no longer theoretical. It was operational. On the 3rd day my sibling called again. This time they did not bother with small talk. They asked directly whether I was taking everything okay. The phrasing caught my attention. Not whether I was upset. Not whether my child was disappointed. Whether I was taking it okay. As if the situation had already been explained, already been processed, already been framed elsewhere. I asked what they meant. There was another pause on the line, longer this time. Then they sighed and said, "You know how mom and dad are when they commit to something they think is important." Important. That word again. I pressed gently, asking what exactly they had committed to. My sibling deflected, saying it wasn't their place to explain. That answer told me more than any admission could have. Truth protected behind etiquette is still truth hidden behind fear. When the call ended, I sat staring at the blank screen of my phone with the strange awareness that everyone knew more than I did, and that the family had silently agreed this knowledge did not belong to me. That realization hurt in a way that felt both dull and precise. The next piece fell into place by accident. A mutual family friend ran into me at the grocery store and asked, with genuine confusion, whether I would be attending the celebration that weekend. I asked what celebration they meant. They looked surprised. "The one your parents are hosting," they said. "For your cousin's new business venture. It's supposed to be a big deal." Something inside my chest tightened. Hosting. A celebration. A business venture. All words that carried money with them easily and without apology. I thanked them for the information and finished my shopping on autopilot. Every item I placed in my cart now weighed against the image of a party I had not been invited to. That evening I searched for my cousin's social media accounts. Ones I rarely visited, the kind that blend into the background of extended family until suddenly they demand attention. The confirmation was immediate. Photos of a new storefront mid-renovation. Captions celebrating family support. My parents' comments sprinkled throughout in enthusiastic affirmation. Videos of champagne glasses clinking in empty rooms waiting to be filled with possibility. Possibility funded by someone. Funded by people who had apparently been too tight to show up for a birthday. The pattern had fully emerged now. It was not that money was scarce. It was that its direction had changed. And that change did not include us. The strangest part was how carefully everything had been orchestrated to exclude us without confrontation. No arguments. No dramatic announcements. Just gentle erasure through excuses that sounded responsible on the surface. Money was tight. Things were stressful. It was a bad time. Language designed to soften rejection into something that could not easily be challenged without seeming ungrateful or unreasonable. It was a strategy one suddenly recognized from years of subtle dismissals I had once explained away as misunderstandings. The closer I looked, the clearer it became that this was not a new behavior. It was simply the first time it had been applied to my child. And that changed everything. On the fifth day, I followed the unfamiliar account number from the transfers as far as public records would allow. The trail ended at a small administrative entity registered in the name of a shell company tied to my cousin's new venture. The same cousin whose celebration my parents were hosting. The same cousin whose storefront renovation was being documented online with lavish anticipation. The same cousin who had always been described as needing more help because they were trying so hard. The conclusion was unavoidable. My parents were not short on money. They were redirecting it deliberately towards someone else's future, at the quiet expense of my child's present. I closed the records and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a long time as understanding settled into a place that no longer throbbed but instead felt cold and steady. This was not about the cake. It was not about the party. It was not even about a single missed birthday. It was about value. About whose lives were considered investments and whose were treated as optional obligations that could be deferred indefinitely under the guise of practicality. The party was 2 days away now. Friends continued RSVPing. Classmates talked excitedly about games and prizes. My child rehearsed thank yous and planned what outfit to wear. The balloons waited patiently in the corner. From the outside, everything appeared beautifully intact. Inside me, however, something irreversible had already shifted. The lie had not simply revealed where the money went. It had revealed where we stood. I did not confront my parents. I did not accuse them. I did not even allow myself visible anger. Not yet. Because every instinct in me now recognized that this was not a moment for emotional exposure. It was a moment for careful timing. The truth had weight. And weight only breaks things when it is dropped from the right height. I needed to understand everything before I chose where and how to let it fall. That night, long after the house was quiet again, I sat beside my child's bed and watched their steady breathing, the soft rise and fall of a chest that trusted the world with complete innocence. The knowledge that grown adults had quietly deprioritized that innocence for convenience pressed into me with a force that was almost unbearable. I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from their forehead, feeling something inside me crystallize. They had chosen where their money would go. Now I would choose where the truth would land. And when it did, it would not be gentle. By the time the birthday arrived, I was no longer operating on suspicion. What remained was confirmation waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. The house filled that morning with the kind of joy that exists only in children. The loud, unfiltered excitement over decorations, over gifts, over the simple magic of being celebrated just for existing. My child ran from room to room in mismatched socks, already too impatient to wait for guests. Already convinced that everyone who mattered would show up. I smiled and matched that energy because whatever truth I carried did not belong to them. Not today. Not on a day that was meant to be light. I had already decided that the lie would be exposed only after the last balloon had been popped and the last guest had gone home. The party unfolded beautifully on the surface. Friends arrived. Laughter filled the living room. Children played games that made no sense but felt important to them. Cake was cut. Candles were blown out to loud applause. At one point my child asked quietly whether Grandma and Grandpa were still coming later. I told them what I had rehearsed in my head for days, that sometimes adults get busy but that it didn't change how loved they were. They accepted that explanation with a trust that nearly broke me. It is a terrible thing to realize how easily the innocent adjust to the disappointments handed to them by the grown world. By evening the house had emptied. Wrapping paper covered the floor in colorful exhaustion. The final guests headed home. My child fell asleep early, worn out not by sadness but by happiness that had done its job well enough to carry them through the day without noticing the absence that should never have existed. Only after the door closed behind the last visitor did I allow myself to stand alone in the quiet living room and fully feel the weight of what had happened. This was what my parents had chosen to miss. Not a social obligation. Not an inconvenience. This living, laughing moment they would never get back. I cleaned in silence for a long time before I finally picked up my phone. There was a new message from my mother waiting for me. Hope the party turned out nice. No apology. No explanation. No regret. Only a performative courtesy that assumed her absence would be processed as something reasonable. The casualness of that sentence settled into me like ice. This was not guilt. This was expectation. That life would rearrange itself around her choices without friction. That I would accept the lie because it was polite enough to look like truth. I did not reply. Instead, I opened the financial records I had already traced days earlier and followed the transfers one step further than before. With the party over, with the illusion of normalcy complete, I no longer needed to protect the day from what it truly meant. The administrative shell that had received my parents' money was no longer just an abstract ledger entry. It was a gateway. And with a willingness to look deeper, it unfolded into something so precise and so coordinated that the explanation could no longer hide behind coincidence. The money was funding my cousin's new venture in full. Every renovation expense, every licensing fee, every supply order, every shortfall quietly absorbed by my parents' contributions. The celebration that I had not been invited to was not ceremonial. It was strategic. My parents were not simply supporting family in a vague, emotional way. They were underwriting a new future. A future they believed was worth investment. A future that apparently outweighed a single child's birthday. The realization did not come with rage. It came with clarity. For the first time I could see the hierarchy as it truly existed, not as something I had feared, but as something that had always been quietly enforced. My child's joy had been weighed against my cousin's opportunity. And in that internal accounting, opportunity had won without hesitation. That was the lie. Not just the excuse of tight finances, but the deeper lie that they had ever been neutral in how they chose to distribute their resources, their time, their loyalty. The next morning I called my father. Not my mother. Him. His voice carried a hint of surprise when he answered, as if my willingness to still reach for him unsettled the story they had already constructed about my compliance. I asked how the weekend had gone. He spoke easily, freely, naming small details that confirmed exactly what I already knew. The progress on the storefront, the excitement of the family, the satisfaction of seeing something solid finally taking shape. He spoke in the language of pride. Not regret. Not conflict. Pride. Only after he had finished did I ask calmly, "How much did you contribute?" There was a pause. Then another. "That's not really your concern," he said carefully. "I just want to know how tight things really were," I replied. The silence stretched, becoming weightier with every second that passed. He did not deny the transfer. He did not insist that they were struggling. He only said at last, "We had to make practical choices." Practical. That was the word he chose to justify absence. To justify a lie told to a child. To justify a decision that erased one celebration so another ambition could be amplified. I thanked him for his honesty and ended the call without argument. I had what I needed now. The truth did not require confession. It had been revealed by admission without defense. The confrontation did not happen immediately after. Because truth, when wielded with timing rather than impulse, does more than wound. It reshapes. I waited 3 days before inviting the family to dinner. I framed it as a belated thank you gathering for those who had helped with the party. My parents accepted without hesitation. My sibling did too. Even my cousin said they would stop by briefly. The table would be full. And that mattered. Lies are strongest in private. They weaken in rooms with witnesses. The evening arrived quietly. My parents came with polite smiles. My cousin arrived late, full of the restless energy of someone whose life had recently been infused with new possibility. We ate. We talked. The topic of the birthday surfaced naturally, lightly. My mother commented on the photos she had seen online. She spoke as if distance were merely geographic, not chosen. When the plates were cleared and the room settled into that post-meal lull where conversation drifts more freely, I placed my phone on the table between us. "I just want to understand something," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You told me money was tight. But these records say otherwise." I tapped the screen. The numbers were visible. The dates. The transfers. The amounts. Silence fell over the table so quickly it felt deliberate. My father stiffened. My mother reached instinctively for his arm. My cousin's eyes widened with sudden comprehension. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply slid the truth into the space where the lie had lived and let it breathe. "This," I continued calmly, "is why you weren't at the party." No one spoke. The truth had done what it needed to do. It stood on its own. The lie at last had been caught not in speculation but in fact. And whatever came next could no longer hide behind excuses. The silence that fell over the table after I slid the phone forward was not the awkward kind that follows a rude comment. It was the heavy, stunned quiet that comes when a story collapses all at once. My mother stared at the glowing screen as if it might rearrange itself into a Kinder version if she simply waited long enough. My father's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the old reflex of control returning even when control no longer served him. My cousin shifted uncomfortably in their chair, eyes darting from the transfers to my parents' faces, the full implication of the numbers clearly settling in for the first time. No one rushed to speak. That was the first admission. Eventually my father cleared his throat. "Those are private matters," he said, his voice firm but suddenly stripped of its earlier confidence. "Family support doesn't require accounting to everyone." "I didn't ask for accounting," I replied quietly. "I asked for honesty." The distinction hung in the air like a blade. My mother finally lifted her eyes from the screen. They were wet but not surprised. "We didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. "You did," I answered gently. "You just didn't see it as harm." That was the second admission. My cousin tried to speak then, stumbling over their words. "I didn't know they told you they couldn't come because of money," they said quickly. "I thought you just had other plans." "That's how lies work," I said calmly. "They only function when everyone carries a different piece of the truth." The room shifted uneasily. My sibling, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "So what is this really about?" they asked. "The money? Or the birthday?" "Neither," I said. "It's about value." They looked at me startled. "You didn't tell me you were choosing to invest in someone else," I continued. "You told me you were struggling. You didn't say you were redirecting. You said you were deprived. That made your absence sound unavoidable. It wasn't. It was chosen." My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a defensive motion that no longer carried authority. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be," he said. "No," I answered evenly. "You made it what it is the moment you used to lie to justify a preference." My mother began to cry quietly then. Not in dramatic sobs, but in the restrained, exhausted way of someone who realizes too late that the story they constructed for self-protection can no longer shield them. "We thought you'd understand," she said through shaky breath. "You always do." That sentence struck deeper than anything else spoken that night. "You always do." I sat very still, feeling the full generational weight of it sink into me. I had always understood. I had always adjusted. I had always accepted the shifting of attention as though it were a natural law rather than a repeated choice. That understanding had become my parents' safety net. My flexibility had become their permission. "I did understand," I said quietly. "For years. That's why you felt safe doing it again." My cousin stood abruptly then, knocking their chair slightly backward. "I never asked for this," they said, voice unsteady. "I didn't know it cost your child anything." "I believe you," I replied. "And I meant it. But now you do." The room fractured under that simple statement. The truth did not assign blame neatly. It only rearranged responsibility into its proper places. My parents looked suddenly smaller, not because they were weak, but because their authority no longer aligned with their actions. My siblings stared at the table as if seeing the family structure redrawn in front of them. My cousin looked torn between gratitude and guilt. My father spoke again, his voice lower now. "We have limited resources. We had to decide where they would make the biggest difference. And you decided my child's did not," I said calmly. He did not answer. Silence once more. That was the third admission. The conversation unraveled slowly after that, not with shouting, not with explosive accusations, but with the sharp, incremental peeling back of years of patterned behavior. My parents spoke of helping those who needed it most. I spoke of how need was quietly defined in ways that never seemed to include us. My sibling admitted they had noticed it, but had learned not to question it. My mother insisted that love was not a finite resource. I agreed and pointed out that time, money, and attention unfortunately were. Every attempt they made to soften the truth only illuminated it further. When dessert was served, no one touched it. The confrontation did not end with a dramatic declaration. It ended with something quieter and far more destabilizing. A shift. Not in what had happened, but in what could no longer be denied. When the evening finally drew to a close, my parents stood awkwardly near the door. My mother tried to embrace me. I allowed it, but I did not lean in the way I once would have. My father lingered as if trying to find a final word that might restore equilibrium. None came. Some balances I had learned could not be reset with speech. After they left, the house felt different. Not empty. Exposed. Like a room where the walls had been stripped back to show what they had always concealed beneath the paint. That night, I sat alone in the living room long after everyone had gone to bed, replaying every word spoken at the table. Not with regret. With precision. I was no longer asking whether my parents loved my child. I was asking how they defined worth, and whether I was still willing to place my family within the gravitational pull of that definition. The answer arrived not as a decision, but as a growing stillness inside me. By morning I already knew what Chapter 5 would have to be. The morning after the confrontation arrived without thunder or apology. Light filtered through the curtains in the same quiet way it always did, touching the walls of my home with the illusion of normalcy. My child woke up cheerful, unaware that the emotional architecture of our family had shifted forever the night before. They talked about school, about friends, about how their birthday gifts would be shared with classmates. I listened, smiled, packed lunches, tied shoes, and moved through the motions of parenting with a steadiness that surprised even me. Inside, however, something irreversible had already settled. The confrontation had not brought closure. It had brought clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, demands action. My mother called mid-morning. I let the phone ring until it stopped. She called again an hour later. I did not answer. When my father texted me later that afternoon asking if we could talk things through calmly, I read the message without urgency. There was nothing left to talk through. Everything that mattered had already been said at the table, with witnesses, with evidence, with the truth standing in the center of the room where no one could pretend not to see it. Any further conversation would only be about comfort, not accountability. And comfort no longer belonged to them at my expense. That afternoon, I sat at my dining table with a legal pad and began to list the tangible ways my parents still had access to our lives. Emergency contacts at school. Shared streaming accounts. The spare key to our house. Occasional financial support in small, inconsistent forms that had always been presented as generosity but now felt like leverage disguised as kindness. Every line I wrote felt like another small door I had assumed was harmless until I realized how many doors together created unrestricted entry into our emotional space. This was not about punishment. It was about containment. The lie had proven that access without accountability inevitably becomes entitlement. Removing them was not dramatic. That was the strangest part. It was administrative. I updated school records. I changed locks. I closed shared accounts. I transferred the emergency contact role to a trusted friend. One task at a time, precisely and without anger. It felt less like cutting them off and more like finally acknowledging where they had already chosen to step away voluntarily. The difference was that this time the absence would no longer be one-sided. When my mother arrived at my door that evening without calling first, I did not open it immediately. I watched her through the narrow window beside the frame. She stood on the porch with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the posture of a woman who had always relied on emotional access as a given rather than a privilege. When I finally opened the door, she tried to speak at once, words tripping over each other in anxious explanation. I raised a hand gently. "We're not doing this on the porch," I said calmly. "And we're not doing it to negotiate." She looked wounded by the phrasing but followed me inside. She began crying almost immediately, apologizing in fragmented, repetitive pieces. She spoke of stress, of fear, of how things had gotten out of hand. She insisted they never meant to hurt my child. She said they thought I would understand because I always had. That sentence again. Always had. The habit of my accommodation had become their proof that they could risk it indefinitely. That was when I realized something painful and final. They did not truly believe I would leave. They believed I would absorb. "I believe you didn't intend to cause harm," I said quietly. "But intent doesn't undo the choice." She looked at me with pleading eyes. "So what happens now?" The question was not about the future of our relationship. It was about the continuation of their access. And I finally gave her the answer she had never prepared for. "Now," I said evenly, "we step back." She shook her head in confusion. "Step back how? You won't be coming over unannounced anymore. You won't be making promises to my child you can't keep. You won't be positioning my family as optional while prioritizing other investments and expecting me to soften the impact. And you won't be explaining your choices with excuses that assume I will always absorb the consequences quietly. She broke down fully then, shoulders shaking, voice thick with regret. You're cutting us out. No, I replied gently. I'm redefining the terms. Cutting out is what you did when you decided our life could be deprioritized without transparency. She tried to argue, to correct, to reframe. But the conversation no longer lived in debate. It lived in boundary. When she left, her figure receded down the driveway with a slowness that mirrored the gravity of what had just been set in place. My father did not come that night, nor the next. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structured. It was clean. Weeks passed. Then months. The practical consequences of my decision became visible almost immediately. Holidays were quieter. Fewer calls came in. Family group chats continued without my participation. I watched from a distance as photos of gatherings I no longer attended appeared online. My parents seated beside my cousins' growing business milestones, celebrations funded by the same redirection that had once erased my child's birthday from their calendar. But something unexpected happened alongside that separation. Peace arrived. Not relief. Peace. The kind that settles into the nervous system when you are no longer constantly calibrating your life around other people's comfort at the cost of your own truth. My child noticed the change in subtler ways. There were fewer last-minute disappointments. Fewer broken promises dressed as emergencies. Fewer explanations I had to translate into language they could emotionally survive. And in that consistency, their trust in the world deepened instead of eroding. My parents attempted to reach out intermittently. Sometimes with apology. Sometimes with defensiveness. Sometimes with silence punctuated by long emotional messages framed as concern. I received them all without reaction. I did not block them. I did not escalate. I simply did not resume the pattern. And in that restraint they slowly learned something they had not expected. Access does not return by default once it is removed. A year later, my cousin's business flourished visibly. My parents' pride in it became public. They traveled more. They hosted more. They lived loudly again, no longer pretending to be tight with money. Their original excuse dissolved under the natural light of time. No one called them out. No one needed to. The truth did not need enforcement once it had revealed itself. And we built something different. Not bigger. Not louder. Just steadier. My home became a place where attendance mattered more than grand gestures. Where promises were small but reliable. Where my child learned that love looks like showing up when you say you will. We celebrated birthdays without extended spectacles. We marked holidays without expectation of external validation. We learned slowly and deliberately what it means to be enough without negotiating our worth with people who once confused resources with righteousness. Years later, my child would ask me only once why their grandparents were not around the way other kids' grandparents seemed to be. I told them the truth in the only way that preserved their dignity and my parents' humanity at the same time. Sometimes adults make choices that show what they value, I said. And sometimes love means protecting the people who depend on you from being made small by those choices. They accepted that answer easily. Children often understand boundaries before adults do. The final contact came unexpectedly on a quiet afternoon when I received a letter in my mother's handwriting. Not a message. Not a call. A letter. She wrote about missing us. About regret. About how she wished she had chosen differently that year. She did not mention money. She did not mention my cousin. She did not mention the party at all. She only said that she now understood how easily one lie can fracture trust more deeply than any argument ever could. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much to answer casually. Some relationships do not end with shouting. They end with clarity. With quiet. With the permanent shift of expectation into something smaller, more honest, and no longer shared. My parents chose where their money would go. I chose where my child's future would be protected. Both were choices. Only one of them was irreversible. And in the long, quiet years that followed, I never once regretted the cost of making it. If this story moved you, challenged you, or resonated with your own experiences of family betrayal and boundaries, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful emotional stories of truth, resilience, and quiet victory.